I actually figured out how to use any JetBrains IDE remotely without any of the BS. JetBrains, in my opinion, makes the best programming editors out there, hands down. And when you compare it to something like VS Code, there's just so much more built in right out the box, like their code refactoring tools, the database GUI, but they have one fatal problem. Their remote development experience just sucks. So ever since they announced the whole remote development thing a couple of years ago, I've been super excited because in my opinion, there's so many use cases. I know many people feel like it's a bit gimmicky, but for example, like say you're onboarding new developers, it's so much easier to have a remote environment that's fully reproducible. And when a new developer comes on, you can just effectively get them straight on there. I mean, the other good thing is, say you're traveling, you're on a holiday and you got your shitty laptop with you, at least you can use it and get the full power of your remote machine and actually be productive. But yeah, the problem is that their remote development solution basically just sucks. It's not just me who feels this way. If you go look at any of the Hacker News threads or the Reddit threads, whenever someone comments about this, basically no one has a good experience using it at all. Even their own product demo that they showed about 2 months ago, if you have a look at it, I'm pretty sure they're not even pleased with the outcome. Anyways, the good news is, like I said, I figured out how to actually use it in a basically seamless way, and it works really, really well. And the way that's done is using remote desktop software. And I know what you're thinking, remote desktop software, this is probably going to be a fail. And the thing is, it would be a fail if you're going to use something like TeamViewer or AnyDesk or some kind of VNC solution, or just standard X11 forwarding. If you used any of those, yeah, it is a fail, and I know because I've tried it. But the way I found that it works really well is using a software called X2Go. X2Go is completely free. It works on Windows, it works on Linux, it probably supports other operating systems, I'm not sure. It is open source. It's basically available for everyone to use. Now, the reason why X2Go works and just a standard X11 forwarding solution doesn't work is because what X2Go is doing is it's essentially optimizing and compressing all that information that would be sent normally by just standard X11. And by doing that, it actually works under really forgiving conditions and parameters. So what I found is that if you've got 100 millisecond latency between your remote machine and your local machine, and you got at least a 5 megabyte upload and download connection between that, you can actually make it work really well and be really productive in it. Okay, so now that I've explained the whole thing to you in the concept terms, let's actually have a look at a demo and you can see how this actually feels and works, and I think you'll be sold by the end of it. Alright guys, so I'm just going to speed run through the whole setup and fast forward through a lot of it. If you want the details for exactly how I set this up, I'm going to put the link to my blog post in the description. So just have a look at that. All right, guys. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up my VM in Google Cloud Platform. You can obviously use whatever provider you want, right? So not the major, you know what I mean? Now I'm going to be using Ubuntu, but you can basically use whatever distro you want, as X2Go pretty much supports everything. So once the VM is set up with Google Cloud Platform, right, I just need to basically use the command they give to actually SSH into the machine. Okay, so just SSHing into the machine, right? First thing I'm going to do is basically I just want to put, instead of using the Google Cloud command, right, I actually want my public key on the machine so that I can SSH without having to go through their kind of authentication. Okay, so I'll pop my public key on there. So I'm just going to test it out now and just make sure I can actually SSH into it. Okay, cool. So I can access the VM now, right? So now I'm just going to install some dependencies that I just generally find useful. So now that my dependencies are installed, next thing is I basically need to install a desktop environment. It's obviously a VM, right? But to run X2Go, you basically got to have a desktop environment. So I'm going to be installing XFCE. Just lightweight, seems to work well. I'm sure it works well with other, desktop environments as well. But hey, this one works for me. I'm also installing a web browser, in this case Firefox. Reason being is that if you need to activate your JetBrains license, right, you're going to need to, be able to access the web browser. Okay, so I've got my desktop environment installed, I've got my web browser installed, and now it's time to actually install X2Go. So now that X2Go is installed, next piece is basically just got to set it up. There's some kind of like database you got to create or whatever, just a couple of commands, nothing major. And yeah, once we do that, we just need to start the X2Go service. Okay, so X2Go is all set up. Now I'm going to be installing WebStorm, right? So I'm basically just downloading the files provided by JetBrains and just unpacking them. So you can see, since I've installed WebStorm, basically there is a binary somewhere from the installation, right? And that's like the target, which when we set up X2Go, we're going to need to provide that because X2Go is going to need to launch, whatever that binary is or whatever that application is. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to clone essentially an open source repo. I'm just going to install Node.js and just install dependencies, you know what I mean, just so the actual code environment or the actual code repository is ready to go, so I can open that up with WebStorm. We've essentially got everything set up, ready to go, and we can launch X2Go. But what I'm going to do is I just want to test out the latency and the actual connection speed between, you know what I mean, the VM and myself, right? So I'm just going to ping my VM, and you can see my latency is about 50 to 53 milliseconds, right? So pretty decent, not bad. And if I run a network connection test, we can see that I'm basically getting my maximum upload and download speed for my internet provider over here to the actual VM. So it's as good as it can get for me. It's not a great speed, but hey, you know, I mean, it does the job. Okay, so now we just need to configure X2Go on our host machine, right, our local machine. So I'm just going to open up X2Go, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new session in X2Go. And so when I'm creating the session, basically, I'm just going to put in the IP address of my VM as the host, right? I'm going to say, hey, I want to authenticate using SSH, or using my SSH key. And as I mentioned before about the actual executable to start WebStorm, right? I need to put that in here essentially as an application and just put the path to that executable, which you can see I'm doing now. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically just set my connection settings and my image quality. So this is obviously something that varies, right? If you've got a really good connection to the VM, you can turn it up and you can get like really crisp, nice looking quality, you know what I mean, UI being streamed to you. But in my case, since my connection is not so great, I'm just going to keep these settings a bit low. Okay, and we're ready to roll. So let's go ahead and launch WebStorm now. Okay, so you can see when I first launch it, right, it's going to pop up asking me to accept the terms and conditions. I obviously need to activate my license on this machine, right? This initial startup part, for whatever reason, can just be slow unless you've got a really good connection to the VM, right? I found some people, this whole part just breeze past it, no problems. But for me, this initial activation and accepting terms and conditions, man, it's just painfully slow, right? But you just got to bear with it because, you know, once you get past all this, it basically works fine. So you can see that, you know, I'm trying to click this checkbox and it won't freaking let me click it. Okay, so we're past the terms and conditions, right? So now I need to activate my WebStorm license. Now this part as well really likes to take a bit of time, right? I wouldn't spam click it or do anything, you know what I mean? If you feel like something isn't responding, instead, if you just hover your mouse over like a particular link or something, if your cursor changes, then you know your connection is responsive, and then you can go ahead and, you know, click whatever you need to click. But if your cursor is not changing or the button's not highlighting, right, then just chill out and wait, right? Because you just need to get past this part, and you don't want to, you know, I mean, overload it with basically whatever information you're sending through. Okay, so it's finally working now, right? So I'm going to go ahead and log into my JetBrains account. And as you can see, it launched Firefox, right, which was the browser I installed before. So even this web browser is actually running on the VM. The UI is just being streamed over, you know what I mean, to my local machine. And just bear in mind, even when Firefox starts, even this can be a little bit painful, right? It might be slow for you. So, you know what I mean? Just hang in there. Okay, so I finally successfully, you know, logged into my JetBrains account, right? And I've activated my license. Okay, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up my code repo that I cloned in here and set up before. Okay, so we finally got WebStorm running, but this is really the last part when you're first opening it where, you know, if you don't have the best connection to your VM, then it can feel like everything's really laggy or slow. Just hang tight, just let it do its thing. But once you get past this part, it's going to work perfectly. You can see it's just indexing all the dependencies and stuff. Okay, boom, here we go. All right, we've got to work on WebStorm now, and now we're in action. So I'm just going to open up the settings. I'm just going to crank up the font size on this just so you guys can see this easily. And I'm just going to enable coding assistance for Node.js just so you can see what the autocomplete's like as well. And so you can see, I can navigate through my project structure easily. I can see all the files and directories, no problem, right? The actual quality coming through for the UI is relatively crisp. It's good. It could be a lot better if you turned up those image quality settings I mentioned before. But for me, it's perfectly fine, right? And even when I'm opening files and scrolling through them, I can basically do it all perfectly without any problems. And the thing is, you can even open big files, right? Like, typically like the log files in the Node.js ecosystem are freaking gigantic, right? Because, you know, we got a ton of freaking dependencies going on, right? And if you see that log file, man, I'm able to just scroll through it, no problem, right? So no issue scrolling through big files. And even if I'm actually writing code, it feels basically seamless, right? You know, when I'm typing, it's really responsive. And if you have a look at the code completion as well, the code completion is working basically perfectly, right? So, you know, if I'm just trying to write, like if I'm writing some code just to save a file to a system, you can see that you know, it's picking up all the type errors, it's giving me all the completions, and it's all working basically perfectly like it would on your local machine. And even things like go to definition, right? Those all work perfectly fine too. I can easily go to definition, I can scroll through these big freaking source files, no problem. And say I wanted to actually build this library, right? I can run the npm build script through WebStorm, and even that works out perfectly. You can see that as soon as I built it, the output files in the dist directory just showed up straight away. So basically works pretty much perfectly like it's on my local machine without any of the problems associated with their remote development, you know, thing of the whole gateway and code with me and yada yada. And so I'm just going to go ahead and close WebStorm now, right? And so once I close it, I'm just going to launch it up one more time just to show you, you know, from this point on after you set it up, at least for me, it becomes really fast, right? So bam, I mean, WebStorm launches basically straight away and I'm ready to go. So no problems. Okay guys, so there you have it. You've seen essentially how I set up the VM from start to finish, right? And actually running WebStorm. And although it was a little bit bumpy at the start, just when you're initially activating your license, it basically works perfectly after that, right? So I personally feel like this is a much better remote development, I guess, pathway as opposed to, you know, using either JetBrains Gateway or using the code with me. Basically, all of those just have so many problems associated with them, right? Whereas this just has a little bit of an initial setup annoyance, but, you know, once you get past that, it pretty much works perfectly. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope I saved you countless hours of racking your brain. And I hope you can finally run any of your JetBrains IDEs in peace.